Beneath the pale light of the Judean dawn, where the desert meets the Jordan Valley, lies a mound of earth called Tel es Sultan. To the passing eye, it's just a low hill, a ripple in the wilderness. But beneath its layers rests one of humanity's oldest conversations with time. This mound, known to the world as Jericho, carries a name that echoes through faith, legend, and science. For more than 4,000 years, winds have swept over its stones, and empires have vanished around it. Yet even now, the dust remembers footsteps that might have once circled its walls, while trumpets sounded under a bronze sun. When explorers first reached these ruins in the 19th century, they weren't conquerors, they were pilgrims of evidence. The Bible spoke of a fortress whose walls collapsed at the blast of horns, and scholars wanted to know if the earth had recorded that sound. They dug with pickaxes and pens, measuring pottery, tracing foundations, and weighing belief against the silence of stone. What they found wasn't a simple yes or no, but a complex dialogue, layer upon layer of rebuilding, destruction, and rebirth. Each stratum was a fragment of a story that refused to end. Early in the 20th century, British archaeologist John Garstang stood before this mound and believed he had uncovered the very echo of Joshua's conquest. He found charred debris, fallen bricks, and grain jars sealed in haste, all seeming to be the fingerprints of a sudden catastrophe. He dated it to about 1400 BCE, the exact time the biblical narrative placed the fall of Jericho. For Garstang, the alignment felt almost divine, scripture and soil speaking in the same tongue. His reports spread like wildfire, carried by the optimism of an era that longed to see ancient texts verified in stone. But history rarely settles so easily. 2 decades later, another voice entered the conversation. Kathleen Kenyon, a meticulous scholar armed with new, more precise methods of excavation. Where Garstang had seen a single dramatic collapse, Kenyon saw centuries of continuous life. Her careful trenches revealed that the walls Garstang had dated to Joshua's time were actually far older, belonging to a city destroyed hundreds of years before Israel's emergence. The layer he called conquest, she called continuity. Her conclusion was cautious, yet it was seismic. At the supposed moment of Joshua's arrival, Jericho was little more than a ruin, perhaps not even inhabited. The debate that followed split classrooms, pulpits, and dinner tables. If Kenyon was right, the famous battle couldn't have happened as told, at least not there, not then. For many believers, this felt like a loss. For many historians, it was a liberation from wishful thinking in archaeology. Yet even Kenyon, devoted to precision, admitted that gaps in the evidence remained. Pottery, carbon dates, and soil layers are not prophets. They whisper, they don't shout. And Jericho, stubborn in its silence, kept its secrets buried beneath millennia of collapsed mud brick. To truly understand Jericho, we have to step back even further than Joshua, back to the dawn of agriculture, when nomads first built walls not for war, but for water. Archaeologists call this Neolithic Jericho, a city of hunters turned farmers. Its earliest tower rose nearly 10,000 years ago, long before Israel, before Egypt's pyramids or Mesopotamia's ziggurats. People here organized labor, stored grain, and guarded precious springs. In this sense, Jericho is less a battlefield than a birthplace, the very seed of civilization sprouting at the edge of the desert. Its oldest stones tell a story not of trumpets, but of survival. Still, the biblical Jericho endures in our collective memory because it represents something profound, the collision between promise and geography, between a faith that moves walls and the evidence that measures them. For centuries, pilgrims have stood on this mound and imagined the shout that shook heaven, even as archaeologists crouched beside them with calipers and notebooks. In a way, they're both searching for the same thing, a trace of an encounter between the human and the divine, between story and strata. Kenyon's methods, once controversial, are now standard practice, and her data continue to shape the debate. Yet, new excavations have reopened questions once thought closed. Some researchers, re-examining Garstang's pottery or analyzing new samples, suggest that a small settlement might have persisted near the mound during the late Bronze Age after all. It wouldn't have been a walled metropolis, but perhaps a cluster of dwellings, a fragile continuity that could, in theory, align with a migrating people seeking entry into Canaan. The evidence is thin, the margin is narrow, but the possibility keeps the dialogue alive. Across academic journals, the discussion now shifts from walls to words. Did the biblical author describe a literal demolition, or was it a symbolic victory narrative written centuries later to inspire a nation? The language itself becomes an artifact. The Hebrew verb for fell, for example, can mean surrender just as much as it can mean collapse. In that ambiguity, history and faith intertwine like threads in a tapestry, each reflecting light differently depending on where you stand. Jericho thus becomes not just a site to be dated, but a mirror reflecting how we interpret our own beginnings. Every layer of Tel es-Sultan bears the scars of fire, flood, and rebuilding. Archaeologists mark them as phases. A theologian might call them testaments. To sift through this soil is to handle the dust of generations who believed their city touched eternity. Some built altars, others built retaining walls. Both left traces visible only to patience and humility. When carbon samples are analyzed, they speak the language of chemistry. When believers read the same evidence, they might hear a parable about cycles of faith and ruin. The difference is in the method, not the mystery. As twilight falls on the excavation field, the ancient mound seems to breathe. The hum of traffic from modern Jericho, a living city thriving beside its ghost, fills the air. Children ride bicycles where soldiers may have once marched. Prayers rise from mosques and churches overlooking the same valley. This continuity between past and present defies any tidy conclusion. For each generation, Jericho is rebuilt, in stone, in scripture, and in imagination. And each generation must decide what its walls mean: defense, defiance, or devotion. What the excavations truly reveal, perhaps, is not a single event, but a dialogue spanning 10 millennia, a conversation between those who believe the story and those who measure it. In that dialogue, certainty crumbles like ancient brick, and yet faith persists. Not a blind faith, but a faith that questions and digs, that listens to the earth and still dares to hope. The mound remains, layered with argument and awe, a silent witness to the oldest city known to humankind, and to our enduring desire to know if divinity once walked its dust. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. See you next time. Under the burning silence of the desert afternoon, Jericho's mound becomes a theater of patience. Archaeologists crouch over shallow trenches, tracing the delicate contours of mud brick that once shaped a city's heart. Each line in the earth is a sentence in a language few can read. The soil shifts easily, fragile as parchment, and yet inside these grains lies an archive of human persistence. Every trench, every cut into the tell, is an attempt to speak with time itself, to ask what happened, when, and why the story still matters. What these excavations reveal is never just dust. It is a dialogue between the living and the long departed. Modern methods bring a new precision to that dialogue. Radiocarbon testing, microscopic soil analysis, and 3D mapping now allow layers to be dated with remarkable accuracy. These tools confirm that Jericho's story began around 8000 BCE, when people built one of the world's first stone towers, perhaps as a watch against floods or strangers. Over millennia, the settlement grew, fell, and grew again. The Bronze Age saw fortified walls rise along terraces. Later, earthquakes and invasions reduced them to rubble. The cycle is so consistent that no single destruction can claim to be the one. Yet within those ruins, archaeologists still sense an ancient heartbeat. As they dig, patterns emerge, jars still sealed with ash, rooms hastily abandoned, fragments of charred grain. Some destruction layers speak of violence, others whisper of natural disaster. A few reveal nothing more dramatic than neglect. The puzzle resists tidy theology or politics. It is the raw rhythm of survival in a land forever contested. To assign one collapse to Joshua and another to time is to miss the greater truth that every civilization eventually meets its wall, and every wall falls by something greater than itself. The academic debate now stretches across decades of publication. Some scholars argue that Jericho's walls fell centuries before any Israelites appeared in the region, making the biblical narrative a later memory or metaphor. Others suggest that a modest settlement still existed around 1200 BCE and that the story of its fall preserved a kernel of historical recollection, amplified through faith and oral tradition. In the absence of inscriptions naming kings or battles, interpretation becomes a mirror. Each camp sees its own reflection in the evidence, believers finding confirmation, skeptics finding caution, and both sides bound by the same desire, to understand the past without silencing its complexity. Beyond the debates, Jericho offers a portrait of how archaeology itself evolved. In the early digs, spades struck quickly and conclusions came faster. Today, every fragment is photographed, plotted, and left in place if possible. The discipline has matured from proving texts to preserving textures. Field reports speak less of triumph and more of context, how soil, climate, and trade shaped the lives beneath. The story of Jericho becomes a case study in humility, teaching that history rarely speaks in absolutes. It murmurs, and the wise listen. Meanwhile, new technology peers deeper. Ground-penetrating radar outlines forgotten streets. Satellite imagery traces ancient irrigation channels that once fed an oasis, now reduced to dust. Even with these tools, mystery endures. Beneath one sector, a line of stones forms what might have been part of the legendary wall, its foundation warped and melted by heat. Tests date the burn to roughly the right century, yet similar fires mark other times. The evidence refuses to kneel to either doctrine or doubt. It simply exists, awaiting interpretation. Outside the trenches, tour guides gather pilgrims under canvas tents, holding printed photographs of the same ruins. They speak of trumpets and faith, of the sound that made walls tremble. The scientists nearby listen with quiet respect. Both groups stand on the same ground, divided not by hostility, but by horizon. One seeks meaning through miracle, the other through measurement. In the heat shimmering above the tell, their voices mingle into a kind of harmony, a reminder that truth often wears more than one face. The enduring fascination with Jericho lies in that duality. For the faithful, it remains proof that the unseen can move the immovable. For the historian, it is evidence that human memory transforms fact into symbol. Neither approach cancels the other. Together they outline the full silhouette of the human spirit. The fallen wall, whether literal or poetic, becomes the meeting point of reason and reverence. It teaches that faith without curiosity turns to stone, and curiosity without wonder dries into dust. As dusk spreads over the excavation, researchers pack their tools. The trenches fill slowly with shadow, as if the earth were reclaiming its secrets for another night. In nearby cafes, conversation continues over tea and dust-coated notebooks. The argument is endless yet strangely intimate. Every new find reopens an old question. How much of the Bible is history, and how much of history is itself a kind of scripture written by those who endure? Jericho provides no final answer, only the evidence that both kinds of truth can inhabit the same ground. In university archives far from the desert, shelves grown with reports, diagrams and fragments labeled Tel es Sultan. Each document adds another layer to the mound, a digital archaeology of human thought. And still, the same mystery glows beneath. Why does this small hill command such attention, century after century? Perhaps because it forces us to confront the fragile boundary between story and fact, between what we inherit and what we can prove. The more precisely we measure it, the more infinite it seems. By nightfall, the air cools and the moon rises above the Jordan Valley, painting the ruins in silver. The tower, the trenches, the exposed stairways, everything softens into one continuous contour. From a distance, Jericho no longer looks like a battlefield or a dig site. It looks like a heartbeat frozen in dust, a memory refusing extinction. Whether one calls it miracle or metaphor, its endurance is undeniable. The walls may have fallen, but the questions they raised still stand, unbroken by time. And so the excavation continues, not only in the soil, but in the mind. Each trowel stroke, each article, each prayer whispered over the ruins becomes part of the same unending excavation, the search for where evidence meets meaning. Jericho, the city beneath the dust, remains both subject and teacher. It reminds us that history is not an answer carved in stone, but a conversation carried on the wind, waiting for those who still have the patience to listen. At dawn, the light over the Jordan Valley breaks with the same quiet majesty it has held for 10,000 years. The tale of Jericho lies still, layered with unanswered questions, yet shimmering with a strange kind of peace. In recent years, new teams of archaeologists have returned, not to prove or disprove faith, but to listen again to the ground. They bring drones, lasers, and delicate brushes, approaching the soil as one might approach a sacred text. What they find, though measured and catalogued, speaks to something far older than any empire. Humanity's endless need to remember, to connect the present heartbeat with the ancient pulse beneath. The data they collect reveals that Jericho's story did not end with conquest or collapse. After every ruin came rebuilding. Even after the fires, people returned to plant, to trade, to pray. It is as if the place itself refused to die, as if the spring at its base, forever flowing from the limestone, drew life back again and again. The Bible may tell of walls falling, but the earth tells of resilience rising. In this, both narratives find harmony. Faith speaks of victory through obedience. Archaeology speaks of endurance through adaptation. Together, they form the twin lungs of Jericho's long survival. What modern excavations confirm beyond doubt is the city's antiquity. Jericho stands among the oldest continuously occupied sites on Earth. Beneath its ruins of conquest lie older cities that knew no Israelite, older altars raised to unknown gods. Yet each civilization left behind the same gesture: walls to protect, homes to nurture, and tombs to remember. These traces transcend religion or nationality. They show that before we were Hebrews or Canaanites, we were human, building shelters against the wind, carving meaning from the dust. In Jericho, history itself kneels to this truth, that survival is the first prayer ever spoken. Still, the question of the biblical event lingers like an echo across the ages. Could there have been a real destruction so dramatic that memory itself was burned into legend? Some seismologists note that Jericho lies on the Great Rift Fault Line, prone to earthquakes powerful enough to crack walls in an instant. Others point to signs of violent fire, to storage jars full of grain left behind as if the people fled too suddenly to eat. To a believer, these are not coincidences. To a scientist, they are data points. But between coincidence and faith lies the oldest mystery of all, the moment when earth and heaven seem to conspire. Today, Jericho stands within modern Palestine, a living city beside its ancient twin. Tourists walk among reconstructed towers, Children sell postcards showing Joshua's trumpets and burning walls. Nearby, Palestinian archaeologists preserve layers that once drew scholars from Britain, Germany, and America. The politics of the region seep into every trench. Permits delayed, funding tangled in diplomacy, but beneath the bureaucracy, a quiet cooperation endures. Israeli and Palestinian researchers now share satellite imagery and soil samples. The past, it seems, can still teach the present to speak with respect, even across walls more difficult than mud brick. As night falls, the ancient mound glows beneath floodlights. The hum of generators replaces the whisper of the wind. A small group of workers, Christian and Muslim alike, stand in silence at the trench edge, gazing at the exposed stones. No one speaks of conquest or theology. They speak of the craftsmanship, the geometry of the old tower, the precision of those who built without rulers or machines. In their reverence for skill, they find unity. Perhaps this is the truest meaning of Jericho. Not victory over enemies, but admiration for ancestors who knew how to build and to believe at once. In academic circles, the story continues to evolve. Scholars now study not only the ruins, but the stories told about them. The way each generation interprets the same stones differently. Biblical historians note how the account of Jericho might have been written centuries after the supposed events, during a time when Israel sought identity amid exile. The fall of Jericho, then, was more than military. It was moral, a metaphor for the fall of pride and the triumph of obedience. Archaeology may never prove the trumpet's echo, but it can trace the way memory shapes nations. In that sense, the ruins are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of reflection. Deeper layers reveal yet another truth. The people of Jericho were never entirely erased. Pottery styles evolve, languages shift, gods change names, yet the settlement persists. The descendants of those first builders may still walk the valley, unaware that their daily paths trace the footprints of millennia. In their endurance, the prophecy finds fulfillment, not in destruction, but in continuity. The walls may have fallen, but life refused to leave. Even the silence of the tell is a kind of survival song. For the viewer standing there today, wind pressing against the ears, the scene is haunting. The desert horizon glows copper. Beyond it lies the Dead Sea, glimmering like molten glass. In that vastness, Jericho feels impossibly small, yet its name still carries global weight. Tourists whisper, as if afraid to disturb ghosts. Somewhere between those whispers and the rustling sand lies the truth, that sacredness is not always in miracles, but in memory. Each ruin, each scar of excavation, each grain of charred barley tells the same quiet gospel. Everything that falls can be rebuilt. What the excavations reveal, finally, is not certainty, but continuity. The archaeologist's trowel and the believer's prayer both scrape at the same mystery. One calls it evidence, the other calls it faith, yet both are driven by longing, for connection, for meaning, for proof that the invisible once left a mark. Jericho gives them that gift, a city where science kneels beside scripture, where dust preserves devotion. The mound holds no single answer, only an invitation to keep asking, and so Jericho remains, both ruin and revelation. Beneath its surface sleep 10,000 years of courage, doubt, and grace. The walls are gone, yet their absence still speaks. For those who listen carefully, the message is simple and enduring. The fall of Jericho was not the end of faith. It was its beginning. In the silence that follows the trumpet, humanity still stands, still digs, still believes.